By long-standing civic custom, the Flaxborough and District Horticultural Society opened its annual flower and produce show with a hymn, the notion being that the Almighty might be induced to regard with partiality the cabbages of Lincolnshire. Mrs. Glossop, whose knees had outgrown her faith, played the organ with seriousness rather than competence. The hymn lurched agreeably across the hall and came to rest somewhere near the last verse. As the final note subsided into the scent of damp stems and floor polish, the townspeople reorganized themselves into their preferred stations, the modest at the edges, the competitive at the tables, and the curious everywhere else. On the central dais, beneath a banner reading "Faith in the Family Allotment," the Chrysanthemum Cup glinted beside the cream sponge. Flaxborough believed in prizes. Prizes were the town's method of converting virtue into something one could dust. Mr. Wesley Bligh, a draper of middle years and immaculately brushed self-regard, hovered about his specimens like a conscientious beekeeper. His chrysanthemums stood rigid and large, blooms the size of saucers, held by wires so shy they might have been ashamed of their purpose. He had 3 rivals of note: Mrs. Ida Pell, retired matron with a sentimental attachment to funerary colors; Mr. Norman Link, plumber, cultivator of flowers and bills; and the Reverend Mr. Drabble, whose parishioners disapproved of his secular zeal for trophies while quietly selling him bone meal at a discount. "Magnificent," said Mr. Bligh to no one in particular, which in his practice was tantamount to prayer. He adjusted a petal here, teased an errant thread there, and presented an attitude of tranquil mastery he would be glad to have mistaken for modesty. The judges, 2 councillors' wives, and a man from the agricultural college whose coat had been pressed within an inch of its will to live, circled, peered, and murmured. Their murmuring deepened around Mr. Bligh's display. At the first table of cucumbers, Mrs. Pell breathed through her nose in a way that suggested hecatombs. Mr. Link, less devotional, remarked to a bystander that there were ways of getting chrysanthemums to show their best that were not, strictly speaking, illegal, but could hardly be called matrimonial either. "It's the feed," he said. "There's a thing comes from Holland, phosphatic, gets into their character." "Ah," said the bystander, who had no objection to a Dutch influence provided it kept to itself. The luncheon interval was marked by a bell struck exactly twice, in obedience to custom and because the bell had lost the will to participate after 3. People drifted to the side tables where tea stood in serried ranks, brown, hot, and equal, guarded by committee ladies who regarded milk as a form of dissent. Sandwiches had the careful thinness of economy, parading as refinement. In a corner, the raffle prizes were arranged beneath a notice in stern italics: "Please do not finger the prizes." The prizes, accustomed to this annual injunction, lay stoically unfingered, a knitted tea cozy the color of melancholy, a bottle of something described as fruit wine, and a boxed torch labeled British and reliable, with a price sticker that had a heroic confidence in both adjectives. Just after the sandwiches made their second appearance, now described as a few more, a small stir began near the dais. It was of the kind that starts with one person taking a step back and becomes, in a very short time, a discreet uncertainty shared by 20. The stir spread its vibrations along the trestles and down to the jam tarts. People found themselves not exactly hurrying, but very definitely arriving near the Chrysanthemum Cup, where, upon a chair borrowed from the reading circle, Mr. Wesley Bligh sat with his head tilted at an angle commonly reserved for the prayerful and the newly departed. "Mr. Bligh," said Mrs. Glossop, shaking him in a way that combined solicitude with an unacknowledged hope that a man who had so often beaten her sponge cake might, in extremis, prove less stable. He did not respond. His hands, which had arranged petals with surgeonly application that morning, lay palms upward in resignation to any verdict. "Fetch Dr. Hockley," someone said. Then, in an amendment to civic theology, and perhaps the police. Dr. Hockley arrived from his surgery with a black bag, a visible reputation for briskness, and a tie that had learned to live with everything. He examined Mr. Bligh without either drama or apology. When he looked up, it was with the expression of a man who had been offered a riddle he could solve but did not propose to enjoy. "Gone," he said, in the tone of a librarian reporting a missing volume that the borrower swears was returned. "Not recent. Perhaps an hour. Possibly a little more." "An hour?" repeated Mrs. Pell, indignant at the suggestion that death might have taken place under her nose without requesting permission. "He was speaking to me barely. Oh!" She stopped to perform arithmetic on her recollection. Time, confronted with indignation, made a tactical retreat. The committee ladies conferred. It was decided that the show must, in some fashion, go on. Somewhere behind the middle trestle, where dahlias stood like pacifist artillery, the Reverend Mr. Drabble offered a prayer of careful generality. He did not mention Mr. Bligh by name, which displeased those who preferred their consolations personalized. Still, the word unexpected was used 3 times, which satisfied those who enjoyed accuracy. Inspector Purbright arrived without noticeable haste, which in Flaxborough was the same as arriving at once. He had the agreeable, vaguely apologetic demeanor of a householder who has discovered a wasp's nest in the garden and does not wish to alarm the guests. With him came Sergeant Love, a large, comfortable man whose eyes had a way of reflecting other people's thoughts a moment before they uttered them. Purbright listened to Dr. Hockley, nodded thoughtfully at the imprecision of an hour, and looked around as one might look at a picture one was expected to admire, but not compelled to understand. The scene of death had a tidy indecency about it. The chair, the chrysanthemums, the cup, all in a tranquil arrangement that suggested a photograph in a monthly devoted to amateur triumphs. "Who found him?" Purbright asked, in a voice whose courtesy made the question seem as natural as observing the weather. "I suppose it was me," said Mrs. Glossop, though really it was the cup that drew one's eye at first. "You expect it to be given, you know, not, well, occupied." "Quite," said Purbright. He stooped to look at Mr. Bligh's shoes, which were new enough to be persuasive, and at his lapel, where a pin in the shape of a spool of thread alluded to the drapery that had kept him in a state of moral solvency for 30 years. On the table beside the chair stood a teacup. Its saucer bore a small crescent of moisture, as if the cup had briefly regretted something and then decided against it. The tea within had grown that precise skin which tells the wary that conversation has been prolonged. "Did Mr. Bligh drink tea?" Purbright asked, not because it mattered, but because people are generous with truths that seem trivial. "Tea," said Mrs. Pell. "He refused it, said it clouded his palate. For scents, you know, in the blooms. He said it made one's hands smell vulgar," added Mr. Link, seizing the opportunity to contribute a character assessment. "As if he knew different kinds of vulgar." "Yet here's a cup," observed Love, leaning in. He lifted it carefully, sniffed with the reverence of a man taking counsel from history, and grimaced. "Fruit wine?" "Do try to keep police work separate from refreshment, Sergeant," said Purbright mildly. "It gives people ideas." "Sorry, sir." A little way off, the agricultural man from the college was explaining to 2 ladies that certain chrysanthemum varieties, when exposed to ethylene, showed a distressing collapse of dignity. The ladies were grateful to ethylene for offering them a conversational bridge between science and malice. "Who was with Mr. Bligh after the hymn?" Purbright asked, turning to the semicircle of witnesses who had already begun to rehearse their versions for future use. "I saw him at the Cucumbers," offered the raffle stewardess, whose volunteerism had hardened into a moral stance. He was not approving. "Mr. Bligh seldom approved of anything he had not arranged," said Mrs. Glossop, which, interpreted, meant the late draper had been useful in many committees and liked to count the spoons. "Then he was at his blooms," said Dr. Hockley, arguing with air as he did. Mrs. Pell lifted her chin. "He said my bronze incurves were funereal," which, considering his position now, I think unkind. Did anyone see him sit down? Purbright's tone suggested mild curiosity about the seating customs of the town rather than a forensic demand. No one had. The chair had been there, moved from the reading circle's corner when someone thought the dais looked unwelcoming without a human element. Mr. Bligh had supplied the element at some unobserved juncture, and then had ceased to offer any at all. "Doctor," said Purbright, "nothing to suggest our friend was hurried out of life." Dr. Hockley frowned at the phrase, as doctors do when policemen turn death into a matter of manners. "No marks, no mess. Heart would be my preliminary conclusion. There may be—" He gestured with the reluctance of a man inviting bureaucracy to lunch. "Questions?" "Of course," said Purbright. "There usually are." He made no note, which alarmed several people who had counted on providing something quotable. Instead, he drifted nearer the chrysanthemums. They had the complacency of victors. A small gilt label on the cup read, "Presented by Miss Ivy Flitch for excellence in chrysanthemum culture, 1929. Miss Flitch, who had once run a hairdressing establishment where dignity was restored at a competitive price, sat in a folding chair regarding her gift with an expression that suggested 1929 had been a good year for both hair and chrysanthemums. Purbright's eye paused on a trivial thing that is so trivial as to seem rude to mention. A white paper tag, the kind threaded on fine wire, lay on the floor beneath the table leg. It had no writing on it. The wire loop was open, as if undecided where to belong. He nudged it with the toe of his shoe, then left it alone. A tag without a name is a social embarrassment. "Sergeant," he said, "you might ask the committee ladies to continue with the judging insofar as they feel able. It would be a pity to let the Marrows lapse into nihilism." "Sir, and perhaps someone could find Mr. Bligh's sister. He has one, I think." "Miss Bligh," supplied Mrs. Glossop promptly. "Millinery, conservative hats. She will be distraught, or possibly not. Families are complicated." "As are chrysanthemums," murmured Purbright. The show resumed in a sort of qualified way. The judges conferred with the solemnity of diplomats at a very small congress. Prizes were withheld pending developments, a phrase that moved through the hall like a new tune one is not sure one likes. By the time the station clock was preparing for 4, the public had recommitted itself to habit. Tea was consumed in honor of continuity. Mrs. Pell's bronze incurves were admired with a new tenderness reserved for anything that had so nearly shared a dais with catastrophe. Mr. Link offered free estimates on the repair of a leaking fountain that had not leaked in 20 years. The Reverend Mr. Drabble, having mentioned hope twice in an address of 20 sentences, decided he had done what could be expected and went to look at the carrots. Inspector Purbright stood for a moment alone beside the empty chair. He looked not at it, but at the teacup on its saucer, and then at the white tag under the table leg. His face showed nothing beyond that mild interest he carried about like a visiting card. "Death without a witness," he said quietly, a phrase not so much uttered as stored where it would be handy later. Then he put on his hat, which had no detectable opinion, and moved, with the gentlest of purpose, into the hum of Flaxborough's afternoon. Miss Bligh's reaction to the news was measured, though whether this was the result of shock or a lifetime's practice at keeping her face uncracked was not immediately clear. She stood behind the counter of her millinery shop in a hat the color of wet slate, and listened to Purbright's formal statement with a faintly tilted head, as if appraising a piece of ribbon of dubious quality. "So," she said at last, smoothing the edge of a ledger, "Wesley is dead." Purbright inclined his head. "Dr. Hockley believes the cause to be natural, but as the circumstances were public, there will be the usual formalities." She nodded once, briskly, as though approving an arrangement of chrysanthemums that someone else had cut. "I dare say you'll be wanting to ask me whether my brother had enemies." "He did, Inspector. Most people do, if they have any standards." "Love, who had been studying a display of fascinators with the polite bafflement of a man who had never before been confronted with them, turned slightly at that. Miss Bligh's gaze did not soften. He was not liked in certain quarters, but then he did not waste his time cultivating the wrong sort. He had views. Indeed, said Purbright, who had already heard several versions of these views from the flower show crowd. Might you recall if he mentioned anyone lately in a way that suggested, well, more than mild disapproval? She considered, eyes briefly narrowing. Mrs. Pell, she resents his success, and Mr. Link, though I believe Norman's resentment was more practical. He claimed my brother owed him for work on the shop roof. I'm sure that's nonsense. Wesley was punctilious about money. She hesitated, then added, unless, of course, he felt the charge was extortionate. Purbright thanked her and let the silence breathe a little, noting how her hands stayed perfectly still on the counter. When she did finally shift them, it was to adjust a box of hat pins, neatly, precisely, as though the world had not altered outside. Back on the pavement, the air carried the faint sweetness of a late September afternoon, tinged with something sharper, the aftertaste of gossip already at work. Love gave a low whistle. Doesn't seem much broken up, sir. Grief, said Purbright mildly, is often too polite to show itself before strangers. Or it's engaged elsewhere. They turned into the market square, where the town's pulse could be read in the clumps of people lingering by the bus stop, the ironmonger's, and the bakery window. A pair of council ladies broke off their murmured conference as the two policemen passed, replacing it with expressions of neutral benevolence. Purbright, whose acquaintance with such masks was long-standing, returned the look with equal cordiality. Outside the public library, the Reverend Mr. Drabble intercepted them with an anxious bow. "Inspector, a word, if you please. About poor Mr. Bligh. I cannot help but think there may have been influences." Purbright invited him to elaborate. "Certain visitors to the parsonage," Drabble went on, lowering his voice to what he no doubt believed was a confidential register, "have spoken of a misunderstanding. It appears Mr. Bligh, in the course of arranging the society's accounts, questioned the legitimacy of certain expense claims. One name mentioned, purely in passing, you understand, was that of Mrs. Pell. That name is enjoying a busy afternoon," Purbright said softly. Drabble nodded gravely, unaware of the inspector's irony. "Of course, I would not suggest anything untoward, but people are sensitive when their probity is questioned." The vicar drifted away toward the library door, leaving Purbright and Love in the little swirl of dust his cassock had stirred. The sergeant glanced sideways. "That's 2 votes for Mrs. Pell. Think she'll be pleased to win?" People rarely appreciate prizes they haven't entered for, Love. But it will be instructive to see how she reacts to the attention. As they resumed their walk, Purbright's gaze wandered without seeming to search, settling momentarily on the reflection in a chemist's window. His own figure beside Love's, framed by the comings and goings of the square. Somewhere behind them, in the tangled skein of conversations, a thread of truth was running, thin, almost invisible, but pulling steadily toward whatever lay at its end. And at that end, he suspected, would be not just the manner of Mr. Bligh's departure, but the small, nameless cause of it, perhaps no larger than the blank paper tag lying under a table leg in a hall still heavy with the scent of chrysanthemums. Mrs. Pell's front garden gave the impression of having been trimmed with nail scissors by someone who disapproved of waste. The grass, cropped into tight compliance, met a border of dahlias in rigid salute. It was Love who rang the bell, his large hand making the brass button look like a toy. Mrs. Pell answered in an apron that had seen better wash days and a hat of the sort worn to demonstrate resilience against drafts. Her eyes, bright as if polished for visitors, darted between the 2 policemen. "Inspector," she said, in a tone intended to suggest welcome, And Sergeant, you'll be wanting tea, I suppose." "That's kind of you, Mrs. Pell," said Purbright, stepping into a hall scented faintly of polish and boiled cabbage. "We shan't keep you long." They were shown into a sitting room where the wallpaper was of a design to discourage any thoughts of gaiety. On the mantelpiece, beside a photograph of a soldier in a First World War uniform, stood a small silver-plated vase cradling 3 chrysanthemums of the deep bronze variety. "Yours from the show?" Purbright asked as they sat. Mrs. Pell's lips thinned. They would have been. "But the cup will be going begging this year, I suppose." Purbright inclined his head sympathetically. "A sad business. I understand you spoke with Mr. Bligh not long before." He let the sentence fall away like an overripe apple. Her eyes sharpened. "I did. And he was in one of his critical moods. Said my blooms looked ready for a funeral. I told him, well, flowers can't choose the company they keep." Love, who had settled into a chair that seemed to resent his weight, asked, "Did you notice anything odd about him? Seemed unwell." Mrs. Pell pursed her lips, considering. "He was flushed, now you mention it. But then, the hall was warm, and he'd been fussing over those great pale monstrosities of his. He was always particular about them, like a hen with her eggs." She hesitated, then added, "Mind you, he'd been sniffing around the accounts lately. Society funds. Made a nuisance of himself asking awkward questions." Purbright's expression was one of mild interest, as though such matters were the natural weather of small-town committees. "About the flower show accounts?" "Partly. And the societies. Always imagining some of us were padding expenses, as he called it. I told him straight, if he thought I was stealing the tea money, he could say so to my face." "And did he?" Purbright's tone was gently inquiring, like a man asking whether the bus had come on time. Mrs. Pell sniffed. Not in so many words, but his meaning was plain enough. He could be sly, Inspector, sly as vinegar. They let the silence breathe for a moment, broken only by the faint tick of a clock somewhere in the hall. Purbright glanced toward the mantelpiece again. The bronze blooms caught the light, petals folding inward as if keeping counsel. "Did Mr. Bligh drink tea that day?" he asked casually. "Not that I saw. He was very particular. Said it interfered with his sense of smell for the flowers." She gave a short, dismissive laugh. But then, he was always making rules for himself, and for other people. Outside, as they returned to the street, Love said, "She didn't seem rattled, sir." "Not the way people get when you're circling them." "No," said Purbright, looking back at the neat ranks of dahlias. "She didn't, but she's the third person to tell us Mr. Bligh didn't drink tea. And yet there was a cup on the table beside him." Love frowned. Could have been someone else's, indeed. Purbright began to walk, hands loosely clasped behind his back. But if it was, that someone else must have been close enough to leave it there without comment. I've always thought shared crockery a rather intimate business. They passed into the narrower streets behind the market square, where gossip travelled not in breezes, but in deliberate draughts through half-open windows. Somewhere, faint and steady, was the rhythm of a sewing machine, and somewhere else the quick, nervous laugh of someone telling a story they weren't sure they ought to. Purbright listened as if the whole town were murmuring clues, just not yet in words he could entirely catch. By late afternoon, the town's rumour mill had achieved a steady, well-oiled rhythm, like a piece of machinery that had been in service for generations and needed no instruction to run itself. In the snug of the King's Head, a half-dozen regulars conducted the post-mortem of Mr. Bligh's demise with the diligence usually reserved for the test match. It was here Purbright chose to pause, not for refreshment, but because such gatherings were like tide pools, self-contained, shallow enough to see into, yet rich with small telling life. He leaned an elbow on the bar, ordered a ginger ale, and let the talk wash over him. Told him those blooms were twice the size they should be. Artificial feeding, mark my words. Never liked his way of looking at you, like you were an inferior species of marigold. Accounts, aye, and I heard he had something on Link. Plumbing work, wasn't it? Mr. Link's name, when uttered, seemed to draw an involuntary tightening in the shoulders of the publican, Mr. Fosdick, who was in the act of drying a glass with an air of patient suffering. Purbright paid for his drink and, after an appropriate delay, strolled to the far end of the counter. "Busy day for you, Mr. Fosdick?" The publican gave him a look in which deference and wariness jostled for position. "Death brings 'em in, Inspector. Like bad weather. Mr. Link been in today?" "Not yet, but he will. He always comes in after locking up the yard. Brings that wrench of his in a canvas bag as if he's afraid to be seen without it." Purbright nodded. "When he does, perhaps you'd tell him I'd like a word." "Nothing urgent." Leaving the pub, Purbright and Love took the short cut along Bellfounder's Lane, the kind of passage where damp lingered even in dry spells and old bricks seemed to lean in to eavesdrop. As they emerged into a yard behind the ironmonger's, they found Mr. Link himself, a thick-set man with forearms like freshly turned oak, standing beside a stack of drain pipes. "Inspector," he said, with the smile of a man who intended to appear open but had rehearsed no further lines. "And, Sergeant, you've heard about poor Wesley, I suppose?" "I have," said Purbright mildly. "And I've also heard you did some work for him." Link's smile tightened. "Roof repairs? Didn't take kindly to the bill, mind. Said it was robbery. I told him he could try getting the vicar to do it for a hymn." "You were at the show today?" "Briefly. Had a look at the vegetables. Said hello to one or two people. Then I was off. Work waiting, you know." Purbright regarded him for a moment, head slightly tilted. "Did you speak to Mr. Bligh there?" "Not properly. Just nodded. He was fussing over his flowers. Same as always. Cup of something on the table. Smelt fruity. Not my sort of drink." "That's interesting," said Purbright, as if it were merely a point of horticulture. "Several people have remarked on that cup, yet Mr. Bligh was not known to drink tea. Or fruit wine." Link shrugged, a movement half lost in the breadth of his shoulders. "Maybe it wasn't his." "Quite," said Purbright. "And if it wasn't, then whoever it belonged to was very near him indeed." They parted on cordial terms, Link hefting his wrench bag as though it contained nothing more dangerous than habit. As they walked away, Love muttered, "That's the fourth time we've heard about that drink, sir. Either it's the town's newest celebrity, or it's the one thing nobody wants to own." Purbright smiled faintly. "When an object is so universally disclaimed, Sergeant, I find it worth a second look, or perhaps a third." The evening light was slanting low now, glazing the market square in amber. The flower show hall stood closed, its windows dark, but in Purbright's mind the scene inside was still lit. The chair, the cup, the blooms, and that cup on its saucer, wearing its thin skin like a quiet accusation. The following morning found Flaxborough cloaked in the sort of weather that encouraged second cups of tea and postponement of anything resembling exertion. A fine mist blurred the edges of the market square, softening the outlines of delivery vans and the slow-moving figures that crossed between shops. Purbright, however, seemed unaffected by the town's mood for torpor. He arrived at the police station just after 8, hung his coat with unhurried precision, and summoned Sergeant Love with the air of a man about to play the next, rather careful, move in a long game. "I'd like us to take another look at the flower show hall," he said, "particularly the table where Mr. Bligh was found. Details have a way of altering themselves when viewed in a new light, sometimes literally." The hall was still thick with the scents of yesterday. Chrysanthemums, floor polish, and that faint, almost cloying trace of fruit wine. The prize tables remained set out, though some blooms had begun to wilt under the authority of neglect. A committee member, Miss Flitch, in a coat that might once have been camel but was now more the shade of weary biscuit, met them at the door. "Inspector," she said, lowering her voice as if the chrysanthemums might be listening. "We haven't touched a thing," felt it best to leave matters as they were, just in case. Purbright thanked her and made his way to the dais. The chair sat precisely where it had been, its cushions bearing the faint impression of a man who would not return. On the table beside it, the cup had been covered with a glass dome, Miss Flitch's doing, no doubt, and the teacup remained on its saucer, the liquid inside reduced now to a darker, more viscous pool. He examined it without touching. The crescent of moisture on the saucer had dried to a faint ring, and a pale smear on the cup's rim suggested that it had been sipped once, perhaps twice. No lipstick trace, but then, not all paint is rouge. Love, crouching nearby, lifted something from beneath the table. "Same tag you spotted yesterday, sir." Purbright peered down. The small paper rectangle dangled from its thin loop of wire like a leaf refusing to fall. "Yes, blank. But tags are not usually blank. They're for names, categories, labels. When they're empty, it is either because someone forgot or because someone removed what was there." Miss Flitch was hovering in the background, plainly resisting the urge to speak. Purbright gave her a mild nod. "Was this table always for Mr. Bligh's display?" "Oh, yes," she said quickly. "He liked to be near the center. Good for the light, you know, though he moved his blooms yesterday morning. Said the draft from the door would bruise the petals. And before he moved them?" She thought for a moment. They were on the end table, next to Mrs. Pell's. Purbright exchanged a glance with Love. "I see. And the tag?" Miss Flitch hesitated. "Well, when the entries are rearranged, the tags are sometimes swapped just to keep things correct. But they're never left blank. That would be untidy." Outside in the misty air, Love exhaled through his teeth. "So somebody had a tag that didn't match where they wanted it, swapped it, left this one bare." "Possibly," Purbright agreed. "Or possibly they didn't want any label at all, at least not for the judges to see." He began to walk, hands clasped behind his back in his usual posture of musing. People are rather more willing to poison the atmosphere of a committee than a person. But occasionally, Sergeant, the latter is the byproduct of the former. As they turned into the high street, the mist curled in their wake, closing the view behind them like a curtain. Somewhere within the quiet, Purbright could feel the investigation turning, very slightly, on that small unmarked tag and the cup of something fruity that no one claimed. The two together formed a detail that, once fixed in place, might prove inconveniently telling for somebody. Their next call was to the modest brick bungalow at the edge of town where Dr. Hockley kept both his surgery and his personal comfort. The doctor was at home, seated in an armchair with the morning, paper spread across his knees, and received Purbright with the wary courtesy of a man accustomed to conversations that begin harmlessly but end in forms to be signed. "Inspector," he said, folding the paper without quite losing his place. "Still on about poor Bligh, are we?" "Still," Purbright confirmed, taking a seat opposite. "I'd like to be absolutely clear on your impressions yesterday. You said death was likely natural, heart failure perhaps, but not certain?" Hockley steepled his fingers. "Not certain, no. His color suggested strain, yes, but there was no visible trauma, no convulsion marks. If you're asking whether it could have been helped along, well..." He hesitated, then shrugged. "It's possible. Some cardiac toxins don't leave an obliging trace in a cursory look-over, but it would take a laboratory to say more." Purbright nodded, letting the statement linger a moment. "You didn't happen to notice the teacup beside him?" The doctor gave a thin smile. "Difficult to miss. Odd thing that he was sniffy about tea. I took it for someone else's." "And did you smell the contents?" "Only in passing. Sweetish, faintly sour underneath. Fruit wine or cordial? More wine than fruit, I'd say. Not to my taste, but it wouldn't kill a man unless you adulterated it." When they left the surgery, Love remarked, "That's the fifth person to say it wasn't Bligh's drink, sir. At this rate, we'll have to start a list of everyone in Flaxborough who didn't own that cup." Lists can be useful, Purbright said mildly, especially when they're long enough to make the absentees obvious. The following hour they spent in quiet but deliberate errands, short visits to the ironmongers, the post office, even the tobacconists, where Purbright exchanged pleasantries that to Love's ear contained little substance. Yet each time they left, the inspector seemed to carry away some small scrap of private arithmetic, adding it to a sum not yet disclosed. It was on the way back toward the station, passing the narrow arch that led to the Society's rented storeroom, that Purbright paused. A faint sound carried from within, the scrape of a chair leg, the subdued rustle of paper. He stepped inside, Love close behind. At the far table, bent over a ledger with the guilty concentration of a man who has not been invited to do so, was Mr. Norman Link. He straightened too quickly, smiling a shade too broadly. "Just tidying up for the committee," Link said. "No harm in checking the books, eh?" "None at all," Purbright agreed, his voice warm enough to be mistaken for approval, though I imagine Mrs. Pell might prefer to be present when figures are examined. Avoids misunderstandings. Link gave a dry chuckle. "She can look all she likes. Nothing to hide here." Purbright's gaze drifted, quite without haste, to a small cardboard box at the end of the table. From beneath its lid protruded a twist of thin wire attached to what might have been the corner of a paper tag. He said nothing about it then. Instead, he thanked Link for his diligence, suggested the ledger be locked away when not in official use, and stepped back into the daylight. Love waited until they were clear of the arch before speaking. "That looked a lot like the tag from under Bligh's table, sir." "It did," Purbright said, adjusting his pace to the slow, even rhythm of a man with no reason to hurry. "But it's no use leaping to that conclusion until we're quite sure." He looked down the length of the street, where the mist had finally thinned and the sunlight was beginning to sharpen edges again. "If that tag is what I think it is, Sergeant, then we've just seen the first loose thread in a piece of mending that someone hoped would never be unpicked." By mid-afternoon, the thread Purbright had noticed seemed to tug of its own accord. A message arrived at the station from the secretary of the Horticultural Society, a brisk widow named Mrs. Smeaton, requesting that the inspector call by at his earliest convenience to clear up a small but unfortunate mix-up with the exhibits. Purbright, who was rarely in a hurry, yet never precisely late, presented himself at the Society office within the hour. The place was a narrow upstairs room above a solicitor's, its windows looking down on the traffic in the high street. Mrs. Smeaton, in a jacket the colour of a bruised peach, met him at the door with a ledger clutched to her chest. "It's about the tags, Inspector," she said without preamble. "When we packed things away after the show, I found one in the bottom of the tin, blank but with a smudge where the ink had been wiped. That's irregular." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "You don't happen to know which table it had belonged to?" "I can only suppose it was from one of the central displays. Mr. Bligh's, perhaps, though he was always very particular. He'd never present a bloom without its proper label." Purbright took the tag from her. The wire was bent at an angle that suggested hurried removal, and the faint smudge could almost have been an initial. If one squinted, perhaps the tail of a P. He did not mention that thought aloud. "Did you notice anyone adjusting displays after the judging began?" Mrs. Smeaton hesitated. "Well, Mrs. Pell moved one of her vases, said the draught from the door was spoiling the colour, and Mr. Link fetched water for his cucumbers, which meant going behind other exhibits. But such things happen every year." She paused, and a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "Oh, and Miss Flitch. She fussed with the cup before the hymn, said it looked dusty." When Purbright left the office, the light was already draining from the street, and the shop windows glowed like stage sets in the mist. Love, who had waited outside, fell into step beside him. "That's the second blank tag we've come across," he said. "If someone swapped it, they could have slipped something else in its place. Like a different vase, maybe." "Possibly," Purbright replied. Though the trick with vase swapping is that most people don't look at flowers closely unless they're obliged to judge them, and the fewer people who notice, the better the opportunity for other alterations. They turned the corner into the lane behind the market hall. A single light glowed through the frosted glass of the side door. Purbright tried the handle. It yielded with a reluctant squeak. Inside, the hall was stripped of most exhibits, but on the central dais, the cup still stood under its glass dome. A faint, sweetish scent hung in the air. Fruit wine, but flatter now, as if it had soaked into the grain of the wood. Love's eyes drifted to the floor near the table leg. "Sir, that's not the same saucer, is it?" Purbright bent to look. This one was unchipped, the glaze newer, though the pattern matched. "No," he said softly. "And in Flaxborough, Sergeant, replacement crockery has a way of meaning someone would rather we didn't see the original." He straightened, gazing for a moment at the silent rows of empty tables. "We'll need to find that first saucer. I suspect it's traveled no further than whoever owns the hand that changed it." Outside again, the evening had thickened into that damp, clinging darkness that carried sound too well. Somewhere down the lane, a door closed quickly, as though its owner did not wish to be seen watching. Purbright turned his head slightly, but said nothing. Instead, he adjusted his hat and continued toward the station with the quiet patience of a man who knew the second incident in this business had just occurred, only it had happened in silence and under the guise of tidying up. The next morning's post brought a small but telling ripple to the investigation. Among the routine envelopes and circulars was a plain brown packet addressed to the station, no sender marked. Purbright opened it at his desk, watched by Love, who had learned that the inspector's silences were rarely empty. Inside, wrapped in a sheet of yesterday's Lincolnshire Chronicle, lay a saucer. It was the original, unmistakable in its age-darkened glaze and bearing, across one edge, a thin brown stain like a watermark. Purbright touched it lightly with a forefinger, then examined the wrapping. "No note, sir?" Love asked. "None. Which is, of course, a kind of note." Purbright laid the saucer on the desk blotter. "This is a return made anonymously and in haste, perhaps after realizing that crockery doesn't vanish without comment." Love frowned. "So whoever swapped it last night decided it was safer to give it back. But why send it here? They could have just put it back in the hall." "Perhaps, Sergeant, they wanted to appear helpful. Or perhaps they feared we'd find it in their possession. The trick is that we now know it's been out of sight long enough for whatever marked it to be modified." Purbright turned the saucer in his hands, noting how the stain was darker at the rim and faintly streaked inward, as if a small quantity of liquid had been jolted and then left to dry. He said nothing more, but the mildness of his expression suggested the object had earned a place in the quiet architecture of his deductions. By mid-morning, they were walking toward Mrs. Pell's house again. She opened the door with a guarded look that shifted into bright surprise when Purbright produced the saucer from its brown paper. "Recognize this, Mrs. Pell?" Her eyes flicked over it briefly. "Looks like the set we use for the tea service at the show. Belongs to the society, doesn't it?" "It does," Purbright said pleasantly. "It went missing yesterday. Turned up this morning in the post." She laughed, a shade too high. "Well, that's Flaxborough for you. Someone borrows a thing and then gets cold feet." Purbright merely nodded, offering no further explanation, and the absence of interrogation seemed to unsettle her more than questions might have done. They left soon after, Love muttering once they were out of earshot. "She didn't even ask where it had been found. I would have." "Precisely," Purbright murmured. Their next visit was to Miss Flitch, who received them in a front room thick with the perfume of dried lavender. On her mantel stood a small arrangement of chrysanthemums, pale yellow, the petals curling slightly at the tips. Purbright glanced at them for only a moment before asking about the cup's removal from the dais after the show. "Oh, "I took it home overnight," she said, as if this were no more remarkable than carrying an umbrella. "For safety, you understand. Some of those young lads loitering about. And the saucer beside Mr. Bligh's chair." Her forehead creased. "No, Inspector. I left that well alone. Didn't like the smell. Too sweet." Leaving Miss Flitch's, Purbright slowed his pace. "We have, Sergeant, 3 separate admissions of distaste for that drink, yet no one will claim to have put the cup there, and now we have the saucer returned to us in a brown paper shroud. It seems that the only thing more undesirable than the drink itself is being connected to it." Love looked sideways. "So the person who put it there may already be thinking," Purbright finished, "that we are closer to knowing who they are than they'd like." And as they passed the ironmonger's, a familiar figure, Mr. Link, stepped out, caught sight of them, and altered his route with unnecessary speed, disappearing into the side street that led, inevitably, back toward the market hall. Purbright did not hurry, but the slight adjustment of his stride made Love lengthen his own. They turned into the side street in time to see Mr. Link pause at the market hall's side door, glance once over his shoulder, and slip inside. The interior smelled faintly of damp canvas and the lingering sweetness of blooms now well past their prime. Link was halfway across the hall, bending over a table near where the cup had stood. He straightened abruptly when he saw them, managing a smile that aimed for breezy but fell short. "Morning, Inspector. Just thought I'd fetch my watering can. Left it here after the show." His hand, Purbright noticed, rested on the handle of a battered green can at the table's edge, but beside it lay a folded sheet of paper, creased into quarters, which Link moved a shade too casually to cover with his palm. "Odd place for it," Purbright remarked mildly. "You weren't watering chrysanthemums from here, were you?" Link laughed too quickly. No, just brought it in for the lads helping with the cucumbers. You know how things get mixed about." Purbright's gaze drifted to the paper under Link's hand. "And what's that?" "Your water schedule." Link's hesitation was barely a heartbeat, but in the stillness of the empty hall it was loud. "Just some notes. Committee business." "Perhaps we might have a look," Purbright said, in the polite tone of a man asking to borrow a teaspoon. Link slid the paper across. Inside was a list of names, the exhibitors from the central tables, each followed by neat columns of numbers. Beside Mr. Bligh's name was a single penciled mark, a small cross. "Keeping score, Mr. Link?" Purbright asked. Link shrugged. "Tally for the heating costs. How much each table ought to contribute." "Yet I see Mrs. Pell's name is circled," Purbright observed. "That's just," Link began, then stopped, his shoulders tightening. "Look, Inspector, if you're hinting I had anything to do with whatever you're thinking." Purbright smiled faintly. "I rarely hint, Mr. Link. I much prefer to listen." He folded the paper neatly, handed it back, and with a courteous nod turned toward the door. "Do keep hold of that can. One never knows when it might come in handy." Outside, Love let out a breath. "Heating costs, sir?" "An explanation," Purbright replied. "Just credible enough for the teller to hope it won't be examined. That cross by Bligh's name is interesting, not for what it tells us, but for why Link felt the need to account for it at all." They walked back toward the square, where the afternoon light was thin and colorless, laying a washed-out quiet over the shop fronts. Purbright paused outside the library, peering in at the readers dotted among the tables. One of them, Mrs. Pell, sat upright with a magazine, her eyes not on the page but on the reflection in the window, watching the street, and perhaps who was watching her. Purbright touched Love lightly on the elbow. "Let's give our friends a little space, Sergeant. The moment you stop chasing a nervous animal, it often steps out into the open of its own accord." They moved on, but in Purbright's mind the hall, the list of names, and the blank paper tag were no longer scattered details. They were edging together, still loosely, but with the beginnings of a pattern he recognized, though he wasn't yet ready to name it. The following day dawned brighter, though in Flaxborough such weather merely served to make people's expressions look more sharply etched. Purbright arrived at the station earlier than usual, set down his hat, and wrote 2 short notes in his precise, slightly old-fashioned hand. One went to Mrs. Pell, inviting her to clarify a small matter at the station. The other, identical in tone, was sent to Mr. Link. Both were timed for mid-morning, with only a few minutes between. Love looked up from his paperwork. "You're bringing them in back-to-back, sir." "Not quite. I'm bringing them in close enough for one to see the other leaving," Purbright said, his voice mild, but his eyes holding that glint Love had learned to associate with the inspector's quiet tests. Mrs. Pell arrived first, punctual to the minute, her coat buttoned high and a handbag clutched in both hands. She sat primly in the interview room while Purbright, all courtesy, asked about her movements in the half-hour before Mr. Bligh was found. "I told you already," she said, though without overt impatience. "Tending my blooms, speaking to people. I did move one vase, yes, but only to protect it from the draught. I wasn't anywhere near Wesley's table long enough to do anything else." "And yet," Purbright said softly, "his display ended up with a blank tag beneath it." Mrs. Pell's mouth tightened. "If someone wanted to play silly tricks with the labeling, it wasn't me. I take pride in doing things properly." He let the silence lengthen just enough before smiling politely and thanking her for her time. As she left, her posture was brisk, but her glance toward the corridor betrayed curiosity and perhaps a shade of apprehension as she noticed the broad figure of Mr. Link waiting to be shown in. Link entered with his usual blend of forced cheer and underlying wariness. Purbright invited him to sit, then repeated, in essence, the same questions he had asked Mrs. Pell. Link's answers were smoother, almost rehearsed. He'd looked at the cucumbers, spoken briefly to Bligh, fetched water, and left. "And the paper we found in the hall yesterday?" Purbright asked. Link shrugged. "I told you, it was just heating costs. Nothing more to it." Purbright nodded, closing his notebook. "Thank you, Mr. Link. That will be all. For now." When Link left, Purbright stepped to the window in time to watch the two of them, Pell and Link, exchange a short but evidently loaded glance outside the station. They didn't speak, but something passed between them, a faint stiffening of shoulders, the briefest narrowing of eyes, like 2 fencers acknowledging that the bout was not yet over. Back at his desk, Purbright tapped the end of his pen against the blotter. "There's a connection there, Love. Not friendship, more like 2 people guarding the same uncomfortable secret, and neither of them wants to be the first to speak." Love leaned forward. "So what's next, sir?" "Next," Purbright said, "we let them stew. People will often tell you nothing until they fear someone else is about to tell it first. Then the race begins." He looked out through the frosted glass of his office door, his expression as unreadable as ever. "And when the race starts, Sergeant, we'll be waiting at the finish line." 2 days later, the race began exactly as Purbright had predicted. It was mid-morning when Mrs. Pell arrived at the station without appointment, her expression composed, but her steps brisk enough to betray purpose. She asked for the inspector in a tone that suggested she was here to do him a favor. In his office, she perched on the edge of the chair, handbag in her lap. "Inspector, I don't like to see my name dragged into something I've had no part in. But since you've been speaking to Norman Link, I think you ought to know he had words with Wesley the morning of the show." Sharp words. "I was nearby." Purbright's face showed only mild interest. "About what?" "Money," she said crisply. "Work done on the roof of the shop. Wesley said the bill was padded." "Norman, well, he didn't take it well. Left in a temper." "Interesting," Purbright murmured. "And you waited until now to mention this?" She lifted her chin. "I wasn't going to get involved. But if he's implying things about me, then I'll not be silent." When she had gone, Purbright glanced at Love. Right on cue. That afternoon, the cue was echoed. Mr. Link appeared, claiming to have remembered something important. He leaned across the desk, his voice pitched for gravity. I saw Mrs. Pell hovering near Bligh's table just before judging. She had something in her hand, looked like one of those wine flasks people bring to the committee luncheons. Could have been topping up his cup for all I know. Purbright listened without interruption, thanked Link, and let him leave with the same quiet civility he had shown Mrs. Pell. Only after the door closed did he sit back and allow the smallest of smiles. The following morning, he invited both to the committee room at the market hall. They arrived within minutes of each other, taking seats on opposite sides of the long table. The cup sat in the center under its dome, a silent witness. Purbright began gently. Mr. Bligh died in a chair on this dais. The doctor tells me his symptoms could have been consistent with a sudden cardiac seizure, or with the effect of a certain quantity of alcohol dosed with something unpleasant. Now, neither of you will admit to placing that cup beside him, but between you have already provided enough detail to fill in the rest. Mrs. Pell stiffened. Link's jaw tightened. Purbright's voice remained calm. Mr. Link, you were in a position to approach the table under the pretext of fetching water. Mrs. Pell, you had the opportunity to be near him without drawing comment. One of you placed the drink. The other ensured it would not be harmless. My guess? The quarrel over money was real, but the true grievance was shared, Mr. Bligh's probing into the society's accounts. He looked from one to the other. Shared secrets make uneasy partnerships. They rely on mutual silence, but when fear sets in, the silence frays. Mrs. Pell's lips parted, ready to protest, but Link spoke first, his voice low and bitter. She's the one who had the stuff. I just gave him the drink. That, Mrs. Pell shot back, was because you said you'd see to it. I wasn't going to. Purbright raised a hand, and the room fell still. It will be simpler if you both tell the full story in turn, under caution. You'll find the sergeant very patient with the details. An hour later, with written statements signed, the two were escorted separately from the hall. Purbright remained a while longer, looking out over the empty space where, days ago, the prize blooms had stood. The cup gleamed faintly in the pale light. By the time he returned to the station, the town's gossip mill would already be working in reverse, pulling in the news, trimming it, shaping it, and passing it along with all the accuracy and dignity of a flower show tag swapped in haste. Purbright set his hat on the stand, sat at his desk, and opened the file marked Bligh. The paperwork would be long, but not unpleasant. Outside, Flaxborough resumed its usual routines, altered only in those small, almost imperceptible ways that follow the settling of any scandal. The end.